So I'm going to be talking about some of the basics of the grid and how it gets regulated. And it turns out, unexpectedly, perhaps, that some of this stuff is really important for the work we're doing. So I will relate it back to what SAFE is all about. So let's start with the role of the grid. The grid is everything that is between the generators on one side and the consumers of electricity on the other side. And it includes all the transmission lines and distribution lines and the transformers and substations. All that stuff is part of the grid. And in order to run reliably, there has to be a lot of regulation, and we'll get into some of that today and why it matters to us. So the grid provides, one of the services that the grid provides is electricity at a certain voltage. And it's important what voltage that is, because too high a voltage and it can damage equipment, too low a voltage and you get brownouts and some things just won't work. So let's take a look at how that happens. So it requires regulation by a group of nonprofit organizations called ISOs, independent system operators, because the power plants themselves, power suppliers, can't really handle the regulation problem on their own. And the people using electricity, the demand side, they can't do anything about the voltage on their own. So it has to be a third party handling this regulation, and that's the ISOs. In the United States, we have different ISOs for each of the local regions. And in the case of SAFE, there's three really that are important to us right now. ISO New England, which is where Lathrop and Hanover are. NISO, which is the New York ISO, which is where Ithaca and Hudson are, and the rest of us are in PJM. And I'll be talking about PJM as the example today, but most of what I say applies, or there's a parallel situation in the other ISOs. So ISOs do a lot of things, but from our point of view, what I'm going to talk about is how they make sure that we have the right amount of electricity to maintain the voltage in the right range. And so there are two parts to that, really. One is the moment-to-moment control of balancing supply and demand to maintain the right voltage. And the other is making sure that the supplies are available when they hit peaks in order to balance in order to keep the voltage right. So you can think of this in terms of a tug of war. On the generation side, the generators are pulling the voltage up by generating more electricity. On the demand side, the users are pulling the voltage down by using more electricity, and the ISO is in the middle trying to make sure neither side wins. If the demand goes up, then you have a situation where the voltage is starting to drop. The ISO has to step in and do something about that, call for more generation. And so adding the right amount of generation in pulls the voltage back up, and you end up with again a balance and the appropriate voltage for customers to get what they need. So that's the basic, basically minute-to-minute work of the ISO. Happens all the time. Here's some examples of situations where it needs to be done. You have a big thing like an aluminum smelter, big user starting up. Well, that's going to lower the voltage, so more generation will be needed then. Or clouds are passing over a solar field, so somebody else has to generate more electricity to compensate for that. Or on a hot day, everybody's air conditioning kicks in, more generation is needed. On the other hand, generation has to be cut back when voltage starts to get too high. That could be at the end of the evening when power consumption goes down, or an industrial process like an assembly line shuts down, or over the weekend, there's less generation. So this is going on all the time. You can actually log, at least in PJM, you can actually log into the PJM site and watch these shifts in voltage and generation, and also the price that has to be paid for the electricity, which varies according to demand. And in addition to calling on generation or telling generators to stop, the ISO also has some ability to control demand. And this is really where they interface with retirement communities to some degree, or can. The ISOs can levy a surcharge on users according to how much electricity they use during peak times. And if you pay attention to that, then you can use less energy at those peak times and save money, and also prevent the dirtiest of the generators from running. They can pay organizations with backup generators, which a lot of us have, to turn them on during peaks. And so that's an opportunity both to help the grid and to earn some money, and again, to avoid the dirtiest generation. And in some cases, they can exert control over thermostats or hot water heaters, or EV charging, to make small tweaks that, when they're carried out over large numbers of users, impact the demand. And in our East Coast ISOs, I don't know of any programs yet of this kind, but in California and Hawaii, they exist. And in fact, Michelle is enrolled in one called Ohm Connect, which asks her to change her thermostat during peak periods and so forth. But these are all things that retirement communities can become involved in if they are available through your ISO or through an organization in your area. So the daily task, as we've seen, is balancing supply and demand. We saw the tug of war illustration of that. But the long-term task, okay, again, I say there are multiple different things that ISOs do, but from the voltage regulation point of view, the long-term task is to make sure there's enough electricity for peaks, because if there isn't, then you can have brownouts where the lights go dim and some things won't work, or in extreme cases, you can have blackouts where the ISO has to call on generators to turn off whole areas of the local grid so that the remaining areas have enough voltage. And so that'll be a rolling blackout where different parts are blacked out for different periods of time, so that the ones that remain in service have the voltage that they need. So how does the ISO figure out what it needs, and how does it get it for these peaks? Well, they look first at the history of what peaks they've had, and they try to project what peaks they might have, and then add a little bit of cushion to that, and see how they can get enough electricity. And you can see from this, this graph, which shows PJM power use during the year 2021, that actually there are only 4 days and a few hours on those days when the power usage was really, really high. And even if you go down to the, let's say, the 1200 line, there's not too many times when you need that generation. So they have to make sure they have some stuff on standby that can handle these peaks. But most of the time, and on most days and during most hours, they don't need it. So how do they handle this situation? Well, they have what they call capacity auctions. And capacity auction just says, the ISO goes out and says, I think I'm going to need on certain days in a certain year, and this goes out 3 years, I think I'm going to need X amount of electricity. Can you put a generator on standby to supply that? And the generator companies bid into that, and the lowest cost bid wins, and they get paid to have their generation on standby, and they get paid regardless of whether whether that generator actually ever runs or not. So, and it's pretty expensive stuff, because these are the least efficient, oldest, least used generating pieces of equipment, and to make any money to keep them in service, the generating companies have to charge a ton for this. So this is an area that's ripe for reform, and we can help out. But meantime, we're paying these capacity charges, which are a surcharge on our bills from the ISO for obtaining all this standby capacity. So how about renewables? Well, renewables are both better for the climate and lower cost than any of the other generating options, but they're not always available. The one that's always available and quick to start up is natural gas peaking plants. These are very inefficient. These other natural gas baseload plants called combined cycle plants, they are much more efficient, but they take an hour or so to get started. These peaking plants can start up in a minute or less. And so they can follow the demand and respond very quickly, but they're very inefficient, and so they cause a lot of pollution, and we need to figure out ways of getting rid of that. Renewables, meanwhile, are not necessarily dependable during peaks, although during summer peaks, the peaks often come when the sun is at its hottest and highest. And so in areas like Hawaii and California, where there's both big summer peaks and lots of solar, the actual problems are starting to shift to other times of the day and other times of the year, because the solar power is able to cope with those high peaks that I showed you from the PJM chart earlier. But anyway, eventually batteries will help to smooth all this stuff out. Batteries could shift surplus electricity from one time of day, say the morning, to the afternoon when it might be needed, or to supper time. And eventually that will really help to smooth those peaks that we saw. But that will take a volume of batteries which is many, many, many times the volumes that are currently on the grid, and it'll take years to get there. In the meantime, what are we looking at? Well, we already, here's one example some of you are familiar with. At Longwood and Crosslands, we had this peak alert program where on days when it seemed likely that it would be a grid peak, we asked people to pre-cool their residence and then turn off the air conditioning during the peak period. And we had a variety of other things we asked them to do. And so the blue curve on the right, you can see the blue shaded area is the period from 4 to 6 p.m. when we did this attempt to reduce these peaks. And you can see we made quite a dent. And it turned out to be worth about $24,000 to our organization, and we hope we can improve on that. There were 13 days when we thought peaks might occur. The only ones that count as far as PJM is concerned is the 5 top days, and the 5 top days were among the ones that we addressed, but of course we didn't know before the summer, what those days would be. So we did our best to predict them. So yeah, so how can we deal with some of these things before batteries become normal, or maybe even after that? Well, reducing annual peaks, you just saw how Longwood and Crosslands have been working on that one. Daily peak shaving, that would be during peak times every day, is another way that in some places and under some circumstances it can be done. It requires a certain kind of metering capability that not everywhere has. Batteries I mentioned, and electric vehicles is an interesting option because we have a lot of cars at our retirement places, and they mostly sit around. We don't drive a ton. At Kendal, I think we found that we use our cars on average less than 2 days worth per week. So that means there are huge batteries sitting in our carports and our parking lots doing nothing. If those could be used, if there could be an arrangement during which, through which the grid could use those batteries while we're not using them and still give us the option to say, okay, I'm going to need it tomorrow, don't use it, or only use half of it or whatever. That's called vehicle to grid, and I think that's going to be a great opportunity at some point. The technology isn't there yet, but it's coming along. Backup generators that I mentioned already, and islanding is where you just turn on your backup generator, get off the grid, and you're saving the grid whatever electricity you were previously using. That's one that some of us can already use. Microgrids is a topic for another day, but that's where if you have multiple sources of generation and demand reduction in your campus, then you need a little bit more management to make sure it all works together. So all of this stuff helps the environment, and it helps the bottom line of your campus. So what I hope I've conveyed is there is an interesting and important role that the ISOs play in keeping voltages under control and keeping the grid stable. And that will just increase in complexity as more things happen with some of the programs that I've talked about. And retirement communities are among the best positioned groups to deal with some of these issues. And the picture on the right is Kendal at Hudson showing solar potential of their roofs, which is great. So that's what I have.